Hi there, my name's Alison Shaw and I'm the Regional Manager in Grampian for Scottish Disability Sport. This virtual workshop is designed to give you some helpful information about including people with disabilities within your clubs and sports and will hopefully help you feel more confident in supporting people with disabilities within sport. As a bit of an introduction, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Scottish Disability Sport and what it does. So our overall aim is to get more people of all ages, backgrounds and locations with physical, sensory and intellectual impairments involved in sport at all levels, right from beginners right up to Paralympian level. We also want to increase the accessibility, variety and quality of sports opportunities on offer for people with disabilities, and we want to help more people with disabilities achieve their own potential in sport, whether that's gaining benefits of physical activity through accessing equal PE opportunities or going to the Paralympics and everything in between. Scottish Disability Sport has worked in partnership with lots of organisations for a number of years, including other Scottish governing bodies, Scottish Swimming, Scottish Athletics, Tennis Scotland, everything. Clubs, coaches, volunteers, people in the education sector, schools, active schools, and our athletes directly. And in the last few years, we've really found that we're starting to make some progress on the inclusion agenda. We've progressed a lot over the years, and it's no longer common to segregate people with impairments into discrete clubs or activities. More and more people with a variety of disabilities are accessing opportunities within their own communities and are being integrated within mainstream opportunities. This is especially important in Grampian based on our geographic location and our landscape. So we're going to do a very short quiz just to test your knowledge and understanding of disability and disability sport. It's only 5 questions, and what I'll do is I'll read through the question, read through the answer selection, and I'll give you a few moments to think about your answer and select one, and then I'll reveal the answer and give you a short explanation of it. So our first question is, what percentage of people of working age in the UK has an impairment? And your answer selection is 12%, 21%, 6% and 26%. I'll let you have a few moments just to digest that and then I'll reveal the answer shortly. Our answer for this one is 21%. So roughly 1 in 5 people of working age in the UK has an impairment of some sort, which is really quite a revelation if you think about the demographic of your club. Are 1 in 5 people that attend your club or attend your sport impaired or disabled in some way? And I would hazard a guess that the answer is no. So it just shows you that if we want to get more people with disabilities involved in sport, there's quite a way to go to reach that sort of 1 in 5 representation of the general populace of a sports club. On to question 2, and this one's a true or false question. Men are more likely to be disabled than women. True or false? I'll just give you a few seconds to think about that one. So it might surprise you to learn that this one is true. And there are various reasons for that figure. If you think about employment, it tended to be that men take on roles that have risks, such as being in the armed forces or working in construction, where they're more prone to accidents and injuries and amputations and things as a result of work-related hazards. There's also a bit of questionable evidence that more boys and men are diagnosed with autism than there are women and girls. However, that may be down to the way that autism and autistic spectrum conditions is presented between men and women, because it's very drastically different. But yes, there are more men who are disabled than there are women. Our third question is, for which impairment group is there currently no sporting pathway in place? Athletes with sensory impairments, athletes with mental health conditions, and athletes with a learning disability. Just take a few moments to think about your answer for that one. So very relevant to this topic that we're dealing with just now. It's athletes with mental health conditions. There isn't a performance sporting pathway in place for people with mental health conditions at present. For athletes with sensory impairments and athletes with learning disabilities, you have things like the Paralympic Games, you have the INAS World Games, which is for people with learning disabilities, you have the Special Olympics, you also have the Deaf Olympics, which is specifically for athletes who have hearing impairments. But there's nothing for people with mental health conditions. And I guess the reason for that is probably because of the lack of permanence that's guaranteed with mental health conditions. So someone who's blind or deaf or who has a learning disability has that for life and has that permanently. However, people with mental health conditions don't always have they don't always show symptoms constantly. However, the landscape of sport for people with mental health conditions is changing. There's a lot of grassroots and competitive opportunities now, which focuses on people who have experienced poor mental health conditions, and with the aim of improving their mental health and their skills and life opportunities through sport. On to question 4. The word Paralympics is suggested to be blended from which two words? Paralysed in Olympics, paraplegic in Olympics, or parallel in Olympics? I'll just give you a few moments to think about your answer. So the answer for this one is parallel in Olympics. And the reason for that is that the word parallel means side by side, and the Olympics and Paralympics are events that take place side by side but hold equal value. The other two would suggest particular impairments. So paralysed in Olympics would suggest that it's for people who have experienced paralysis. Paraplegic in Olympics would suggest people who have experienced paraplegia. However, they don't cover the full range of disabilities which are catered for within the Games. And our last question, question 5. What percentage of the qualified coaching workforce are people with an impairment? 22%, 15%, 8%, or 2%? Just take a few moments to think about your answer. The answer for this one is 2%, which might come as a bit of a surprise. So out of everyone in the UK who is qualified to coach in some capacity, only 2% of them have an impairment. If you think about the general population of people with an impairment that are of working age, it's 1 in 5. It should translate into 1 in 5 coaches has an impairment. However, it doesn't. So it just shows you that there's still an awful lot of work to be done to make coaching more equal and opportunities for people with disabilities. The key theme of this workshop series is mental health, and what we've done below is just outline a few of the benefits to mental health that people with disabilities would see if they were taking part in sport. And if you're looking through this list and you're thinking, well, that's just the same for everybody, then you're right. People with disabilities will benefit in exactly the same ways, in some cases, as people without disabilities. However, the benefits that they'll experience could be exponentially higher because of the people with disabilities are more likely to be isolated and more likely to have mental health conditions. So just to pick out a few of these, ambitions. We all have ambitions, and through sport we can all see that an increase in ambitions depending on our level. For a person with a disability, particularly if they have quite a profound disability, sport may be one of the only ambitions they have. Sport may be the only thing that they feel that they're good at. So it's just so important to offer this as an opportunity. Feelings of belonging. If you think about the people who you are friends with, you've got a lot in common with them. You do the same things. You might go out and do adventure sports, or you might go to the pub. For someone with a disability, they may not be able to access the pub. They might not be able to go on adventures because of mobility needs, or because of care needs, or because of their level of understanding. However, in sport, that brings people together and gives them something in common. So for a person with disability, sport may be their opportunity to belong. And things like independence, especially young people, we find that young people who take part in sport cope better with their independence than people who don't take part in sport. And this is the same for people with disabilities. But again, if you're doing sports and you have I'm going to say a predominantly physical impairment, you may have limited mobility, you may have limited muscle strength, you may have limited range of motion. And all these things are things that can be improved through sport. So people's independent function can be improved, and that then translates into increased independence, which brings a whole new lease of life to someone who may have in previous times relied on others to complete work for them. So I have another task for you, and the aim of this task is to address barriers that people with disabilities might face. And there are many, the same as there are for people without disabilities. So what I'd like you to do is just on a piece of paper or in your head or wherever you've got to hand, just jot down a few of the barriers that you think that there are for people with disabilities. And that might be perceived or actual barriers. And once you've done that, I want you to come up with a solution for each of those. Just simple things that you can maybe do to make things a little bit easier for that person with a disability to take part in your sport or to attend your club. So hopefully through that task you've managed to identify a few of the barriers that people with a range of disabilities might face in your club setting. But we've noted a few of the common barriers and some potential solutions below to further your understanding, add some extra ideas and complement what you've already found. So as I mentioned in the slide before, some barriers could be real barriers and some could be just perceived barriers. What we find is that the perceived barriers are more powerful than the real barriers. And they might be things that are faced by the club, or they might be things that are faced by the person with a disability. So the first barriers I've mentioned are things that are more specific to people with disabilities. However, most of the time, barriers to participation are exactly the same as for non-disabled people. The first thing is lack of specialist equipment. This is always a common one that we are tasked with, specifically where an athlete or a person who is participating in a sport has a physical impairment, because there is a misconception that they need to have some sort of specialist and really expensive equipment. But a lot of the time, we can overcome that either through some makeshift solution, through existing equipment that's available, using things in creative ways, or through getting some funding. So an example of this is athletics. There's a discipline in athletics, wheelchair racing, which I'm sure you may be familiar with. And wheelchair racing bikes can cost upwards of £4,000, £5,000, £6,000. However, a new athlete taking part in an athletics session isn't going to have access to a specialist fitted, racing chair. So what we find is that actually until an athlete is of a level where they start to compete, they would just race in their day chair on a track. So that's quite an easy one to solve. And that's where the knowledge of myself and my colleagues at Scottish Disability Sport comes in quite valuable, because we can advise on these things. And also, if there is a need for specialist equipment, we can advise on funding and help with funding applications. So we're here to support. Coaches lacking confidence is probably one of the most common things that we see, and it can be a huge barrier. One of the best ways that you can overcome this is to attend some training, just to get some new ideas and to get over that fear. And one of the workshops that we run is called Disability Inclusion Training, which is a 3-hour workshop. It's half practical, half theory, and it's good just for breaking down big tasks and big adaptations that you might think you might need to make into small bite-sized chunks, which make things a lot easier to adapt for someone with an impairment. Lack of awareness, again, is a huge thing, because we have Paralympics, but some clubs and some sports just don't know what there is out there for people with disabilities. As well as that, it could be on the other end, where people with disabilities don't know about your club, and that's where advertising and outreach is really important, and we'll discuss that a little bit later when we look at our case study. Attitudes of members, again, that's an awareness issue, and that's where education comes in, and that's where myself and my colleagues can be of use again, to come out and show people what is possible, and to introduce people to the concept of disability sport, and get over that fear. And again, attitudes of members might even just be a perceived threat to someone with disabilities. They may think that the club won't welcome them with open arms, and that's where we need to change our attitude and be quite explicit in the way that we outreach to people with disabilities and other harder to reach groups. The last ones, time, transport, interest and cost, are things that you might be faced with if you are disabled or non-disabled. And these have various solutions. So if someone has no time to do your specific activity at your specific time, is there another opportunity that they can go to? Is there another club that does the same sport on a different night or a different time? Transport, this could be quite a big one for young people, people with disabilities, people in rural areas. And in community clubs, one of the solutions is to organise lift shares if it's safe and if it's possible. And it seems to work quite well in some clubs. Interest. Just because you have a club that welcomes people with disabilities doesn't mean they're all going to come to your club. And this is where we have to be not so precious about getting people involved in our club. So if someone is interested in getting involved in sport, but they don't really like your sport, can you signpost them to their community sports hub, or to Scottish Disability Sport, or to another sports club that you think they might be more interested in? And cost, a huge one. In these really unprecedented times, cost is going to be a bigger burden and a bigger barrier than ever before. And that's why it's important to source out some funding if it's possible, or find someone to support where perhaps there's a free opportunity or a lower cost opportunity, or if there's some sort of subsidised programmes available. And again, for athletes with disabilities and for people with disabilities, this is somewhere that I can assist with. So we're often asked, what's in it for me? What's in it for our club? Why is it in our interest to become more inclusive for people with disabilities? And there's various answers for that one. So below are just a few of them. Equity and equality is one of the big ones. We've gone beyond the equality message. Equity is the way that we should be working to, and that's by giving different levels of support to enable the same outcome for people. So everyone in the community should be able to fully participate in community life and to be equitable in sport and health. And I'm going to ask two questions of you. Why do non-disabled people take part in sport and exercise? And how do you think that would compare to the reasons people with impairments would take part in exercise in sport? And there's really not much, if you answer it, there's not much difference. It's the same reasons, and they can get the same benefits out of it. So why should they not be able to take advantage of opportunities in their local community? Future-proofing is another one, especially in these times. Most people with physical, visual and hearing impairments are now living within their mainstream communities. Their children are being taught in mainstream classrooms and mainstream schools, and a lot of people have been used to integrating within their mainstream peers. So the continuation of these opportunities into sport and physical activity is crucial. So it's people going from nursery to primary school and having opportunities in PE and opportunities in active schools and opportunities in junior sports clubs. Also, people transitioning from primary school to secondary school to college or university, and education into adult life. They'll be used to doing everything within mainstream, and they will need preferably to have mainstream opportunities in sport that they can fit into. Raising your profile is the next one. Parasport or disability sport is becoming more well known, and para-athletes are celebrated just as prolifically as non-disabled athletes. However, statistically, it's more likely that an athlete with a disability will get to the very top of their sport than a non-disabled athlete. So there's a higher chance of success in your club if you welcome and support athletes with a disability, particularly if your sport has a pathway into the Paralympics. So you could find that your athletes are featured more in newspapers, your club gets a bit more profile, and more people want to be like your athletes and join your club. And sustainability is a key one. Again, it's so important in this day and age that we have sustainable clubs. A club member with a disability, they're still a club member, they're still a paying member, so their income will still count towards your income targets. There's so much opportunity and there's so much variety in sport and other activities. There's so much competition for clubs to draw in members. So being open and welcoming to more diverse range of club members will help towards maintaining and growing your club participation levels. Also, people with disabilities won't just have the opportunity to participate and compete in sport, they'll also have options to get involved in coaching, be on committees, take on leadership tasks, get involved in the running of events, and they can potentially offer so much to clubs, so it's well worth casting your net out a little bit further to capture more people. So I'd mentioned before that we've made some really good progress in the last few years, and here's just a few of the stats to let you know how things are going in Grampian. So in Grampian we have over 50 clubs and sessions throughout Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire and Moray, which are either disability specific or inclusive, and it's just brilliant to see that there's so much available for people in a local basis. We've got hundreds of people trained in disability inclusion training and sport-specific disability training. And actually over the last 3 years, we've had nearly 200 people trained. 28 different sports are featured within Grampian as recognised by Sport Scotland. So we've got quite a good variety, everything from athletics and archery to volleyball to wheelchair basketball, wheelchair tennis. There's so much out there. We've got a successful events programme, and that is for school children and adults as well. And there's a mixture of competitive and fun festival events that belong on there. And lastly on here, a few years ago, we used to have Aberdeen Disability Sport and Aberdeenshire Disability Sport. And they came together and included Moray to form Grampian Disability Sport. So we're all working to the same targets, and we're all working to get the same outcome from our local communities. So in order to continue to make progress, we need to do a few things over the next few years. One of the things is to encourage and support more clubs, coaches and organisations to become more inclusive and to welcome people with disabilities. And that's going to be especially important for those living within rural areas and clubs within rural areas where provision is very limited. We want to host more disability inclusion training opportunities, and we were hoping to offer some open courses that people could just book onto this year. However, COVID-19 has put a stop to that, so there will be more courses scheduled for 2021. And until then, we'll have some virtual training opportunities that will be coming up soon. So please make sure you visit the Scottish Disability Sport website to find out about those. We want to grow participation in our branch, Grampian Disability Sport. So we want any clubs, coaches, individuals, organisations or schools with an interest in disability sport to become affiliated, and that way they'll access support, advertising, funding, and a network of like-minded others. There's even an affiliation type that doesn't cost anything, which will just get you some support to get things off the ground. We also want to grow participation in national events. So many of the national events that are run by Scottish Disability Sport are well attended by Grampian's participants. For example, swimming, bowls or summer camp. But we're also hoping to grow participation in sports such as athletics and football. But there's a bit of groundwork to be done in increasing participation levels first. If we want to grow participation in disability sport, we first need to make sure that there are inclusive opportunities available for people with various impairments to attend, and we need to make sure that they are suitable for that person. So in order to create more inclusive opportunities and find the best fit sports and clubs for people with disabilities, Scottish Disability Sport utilises the activity inclusion model below in partnership with clubs and potential participants and their significant others. So the model starts with the participant at the core, as Scottish Disability Sport is a person-centred organisation and each person's sporting journey is completely individual. And then we use 4 variables to determine what kind of inclusive approach would work best for the participant and the club. We look at a person's ability, and what we like to do is focus on what they can do rather than what they can't do. And this helps us hone in on which sports or disciplines within a sport they might excel at or they might enjoy. For example, a power chair user might have really good upper body strength and upper body mobility. They might have good hand-eye coordination, good tactical awareness. They might be agile and really proficient in using their chair. So for an athletics club, they might recommend that the participant gets involved in throwing events such as club throw or javelin. And although we try and focus on the can-dos, we also need to recognise the person's impairment and how that would impact on their choice of sport or their training needs. For example, a person with a visual impairment might find it difficult to navigate independently. So if they were looking to join a canoe club, we would investigate whether the person might need audio guidance or a buddy at the side or another boat, or maybe the use of a double boat with a guide. We also look at which activity or sport the person is interested in, how far they want to go into that sport and how far they can go in that sport, what's available in their communities and what the clubs offer. For example, if they offer a particular sport or multiple sports or multiple disciplines or competitive opportunities, or if it's a social opportunity. An example of this would maybe be if a person with a learning disability wanted to join your swimming club and they wanted to be the next big Paralympian, we'd work with that club to make sure that the person could be supported and that there was a solid pathway in place to help that swimmer reach their potential. We also look at the setting to determine whether the venue, the location, the environment and the eligibility criteria would deem it suitable for the participant, and or if there would need to be any modifications made to maximise their skill development and their safety. So for example, if you operate a running club which takes place outdoors in all weathers, and it has various sections available to cater for different levels of fitness, and then an experienced runner with mild cerebral palsy comes along and is keen to join in, we'd look at which section of the club would be most suitable for their speed and endurance levels. We'd try and make contingency plans for during really cold weather, and that can cause muscle spasms in those who have cerebral palsy. And whether the sessions take place on even ground or if they're on all-terrain could potentially put the person with cerebral palsy at risk of trips or falls. And then once we've looked at all those variables, that helps us determine the best type of inclusive approach for the person and for the club. And there's 4 types of inclusion. Some are more suitable than others or not suitable at all for the participant or the club. And a club might offer more than one type of inclusion. So the first one that we might be a bit more familiar with is open inclusion, and that's what most people would imagine inclusion is. It's where everyone is welcome, and if you have a disability or you don't have a disability, you're doing the same thing at the same time in the same way. And an example of this would be where a person with a mild learning disability joins a golf club. They can just be included just like everybody else without anything changing. Parallel is where people without disabilities will do one activity and people with disabilities will do another activity alongside them. So that could be like a kids football club where it trains children without disabilities on one section of the pitch and it trains kids with a mixture of disabilities on another side of the pitch. So each group has a separate activity but they train at the same time and in the same location. Modified is where an activity or rules are modified for a participant with a disability, but they can train with non-disabled people. So, for example, in a table tennis club, a person who's had both hands amputated could use some sort of strapped-on bat to play against someone without a disability. And specific is where a sport or activity is set up especially for people with disabilities. So, for example, a bocce session, wheelchair basketball or a goalball club. And if you're not familiar with these sports, please go and YouTube them because they're absolutely wonderful. These are specific disability sports which are geared towards people with a certain type of impairment. Now, to make it all happen, we rely on this green outer circle of support to work in partnership with us to make sure that clubs, athletes, participants, other people are all supported and that what we do works. So this consists of your coaches and volunteers. We need to make sure that they're confident and they have the skills to coach someone with a disability. We need clubs like yours and also informal and formal activity sessions to be keen to be inclusive and receptive to people with disabilities. And we also need support from wider partnerships, for example, health, which means like NHS departments will signpost people to sport. They can advise us on what is safe and unsafe for a person, and they can help us support them in their activity. Education, and that could include like inclusive PE within primary and secondary schools, inclusive active schools provision, and for tertiary education, the universities and college, the training of healthcare teaching or sports students, so that they have that knowledge of inclusion to pass on. And also sports governing bodies. So for your sport, you'll have a particular sports governing body that deals directly with your sport. And we hope that they'll champion and embed inclusion within their specific sports and that they'll then support their clubs to be inclusive as well. So how can our clubs become more inclusive? There's a range of ways that you can enhance your inclusion. We don't expect everybody to do everything at once, but even a little bit is better than nothing. And one of the first things that you could do is enrol some of your coaches or volunteers in disability inclusion training or a sports specific course that has a disability add-on. So it could be the general disabilities inclusion training, which covers a multitude of sports, or it could be the coaching disabled athletes course, which is available from Scottish Athletics, or it could be a bocce leaders course. And there are various workshops available through governing bodies, so check them out. You could join an inclusion forum or our branch. Our inclusion forum is in its infancy and it is currently being developed, but you can contact me if you have an interest in offering more inclusive opportunities or want to be part of a larger planning group, or if you just like support for your club and opportunities to network and to help us with events, then we can put you in touch with the branch. Imagery is a huge thing. You can write all about how inclusive your club is on your development plans, on your website, but if you don't have a picture of somebody with a disability doing your activity, then they may not know that it's open to them. So I would encourage you, where possible, to use imagery that is inclusive. Use a wide demographic of people in your imagery for promotion, and get it on posters, get it on your website, get it on your social media pages. Make sure that you are seen and try and get in touch with people who work with people with disabilities. That could be occupational health teams, that could be visual impairment clinics, it could be schools with a learning support hub. Your strategic plan, I did kind of mention this a little bit in imagery. Make sure that inclusion has a mention within it somewhere. If you want to be more inclusive, make sure it's explicit. Make sure that you've written down in that plan somewhere that you aim to be more inclusive for people with disabilities, and this is the number of people, or this is the outreach you're going to do, and this is the way that you're going to try and achieve that. And if you run athlete support programs, for example, for high performance athletes or for young people or for people who are from low socioeconomic backgrounds, make sure that that's inclusive for people with disabilities as well. Especially if it's something that is geared towards athletes trying to get to the very top of their game, because that is often one of the hardest and most expensive stages without getting national governing body support and really high training times, usually high equipment costs because people are training a lot more. So just something to consider. So to let you see how it works in the real world, I've got a wee case study that Ruth Watson from Aberdeen Amateur Athletics Club has helped me put together. And their club's been inclusive for a number of years, and they have about 400 members, and they coach 10 athletes with varying disabilities across their sessions in Aberdeen and Inverurie. And it works out that it's about 1.25% of their membership. The national average percentage is 2.4%, so it's a little bit below average, and they admit that there's still a little bit of work to be done, but they're on it. So that all their athletes that have impairments are integrated into their main club sessions, and that the only exception for that is race running. And you'll see at the top picture we've got Craig, one of our race runners, and the reason that that is a separate session and it's held before their main club session is more just for safety. It's just to avoid collisions, and to make sure the bikes don't get damaged by running into each other. They just need plenty of space to train. So, as I mentioned, all their athletes otherwise are included in their main club sessions. Athletes, disabled or non-disabled, are placed in groups based on their age and ability, not based on their ability and disability. The club receives support from Scottish Disability Sport, Grampian Disability Sport and Scottish Athletics to make sure that their coaches and their club infrastructure, their governance and their athletes are all looked after at all levels. They've got 7 coaches actively working with para-athletes at the moment. However, all their club coaches have received some sort of training on including disability athletics within their sessions, because inclusion is embedded within the UK athletics coaching qualifications. So it's really good to see that, because that just shows you that partnership working that we've done with Scottish Athletics over the years has meant that they've adopted the same kind of commitment that we have. They've also got some of their coaches who have attended additional CPD training, and that's just on specific disciplines like wheelchair racing, race running, seated throws, guide running. And then they also go to some network opportunities where they can share ideas and share knowledge and good practice and improve their skills with other coaches across the country. So since Ruth was appointed in 2016, she and the club manager and the club have spent a lot of time raising the profile of the club. And what they found is that it turns out people didn't know that the club coached athletes with a disability. A lot of parents thought that they had to go to the Central Belt to join an athletics club there. So they wanted to change that, and they've really actively wanted to include people with disabilities, which is music to my ears. So they reworked their website. They created a page just for disability athletics. They reworked their imagery as well, and they now include a lot of information about disability athletics, and they spread it quite widely. They also have inclusion as one of their key messages, which is really, really good to see. The other thing that they've done, Ruth, in order to increase the amount of race runners that they had come into the club, Ruth started a satellite site in Inverurie to encourage people from one of the schools there that work specifically with children with disabilities could come along and try it out and hopefully get a taste for it and come along to the club. So she's really done a lot to try and up the game a bit. So in athletics itself, across the country, across the world, there is a pathway for para-athletics, and that's in place at all levels, from beginners right through to high-performance elite athletes. And the good thing is that Aberdeen Amateur Athletics Club has athletes at all stages of the pathway in the club. So there's lots of people as role models, and there's people just starting out. So their skills are always being tested and they're always being improved. But the system that they have is obviously working because they are getting people right up to the top of their sport. So to accommodate all this, they have coaches working at different levels of the development pathway. So they have certain coaches working in the beginners levels and certain coaches working at high elite levels. And what happens is athletes, as they transition up that pathway, they move to different coaches. And in most cases, the coaching is aimed at developing athletes of all abilities towards the same biomechanical model. However, if a person has a disability, their level of impairment is considered and adaptations are made based on the individual's ability, their impairment, and which events they compete in. And one of the things that we want to highlight is that just being a para-athlete doesn't mean that it's an easy ride. To achieve the top level in disability athletics, it's going to require the same level of input as an athlete without a disability has. It's the same kind of commitment, the same kind of training, the same sacrifices to lifestyle choices, and the same kind of talent. We often find that the journey of a para-athlete can be quicker because the The classification system, without getting into too much detail, means that the pool of athletes for each class can be smaller. So there's fewer people to choose from in some cases, and people can progress quite quickly. But it doesn't mean that they get it easy, not at all. So for Aberdeen Amateur Athletics Club, their experience has been that coaching athletes with disabilities is fundamentally no different from coaching a non-disabled athlete. Adaptations are needed depending on the severity of somebody's disability and whether it's progressive or non-progressive, whether it's a congenital condition that they have or something that's been acquired. But all the adaptations that they've needed to make to date have been pretty straightforward and really minimal. And as a couple of examples, they talk about some of their visually impaired athletes. So one of their athletes with a visual impairment was part of a session involving balance, and they had to stand on a bench and catch objects, one-handed, two-handed, stand on one leg, etc. And for this particular athlete, just changing the colour of the objects meant that they were able to catch the object and complete the exercise. Similarly, one of their other athletes can't see very well in dim conditions and can't see marker cones if they're working on the grass. So what they did is they bought a few wee LED lights and they placed them at turning points in the grass, and now they're able to see that and they're able to fully take part, which is great. For visually impaired athletes, they might not see a demonstration very well, so an additional tip is to be very descriptive in your explanation, and also make sure you give more feedback, just to let them know how they've done, describe what they might need to do to make their skill better, rather than demonstrations. Some athletes with other impairments, they get tired more quickly and they might need longer rests, shorter distances to train over. Other things that might need to think about so that people feel included would be to crouch down when you're talking to someone in a wheelchair to be at the same level as them. It can be less intimidating for them. Also, a top tip, don't touch someone's wheelchair unless you're asked to help. Everyone's well-meaning, but a person who uses a wheelchair isn't necessarily incapable of moving their own wheelchair. In Aberdeen Amateur Athletics Club, what they do for any new athlete, whether they have a disability or not, is they invite new athletes to an induction meeting before they started the club. And what they found is that's a really good way of welcoming athletes and their families to the club. It enables discussion to be had with the athlete and sometimes parents and carers as to what they think they're capable of, what they think they can't do, and what if they have any personal needs at all. On their very first training session, they meet visually impaired athletes at reception and they take them down to the training area so that they get familiarisation with the building, and they're shown where to go. And they always make sure to let them know if there's any obstacles on the floor, such as someone doing sit-ups, which is actually quite common to see on a floor in an athletics track. For people with disabilities, particularly if it's someone who is a younger person or someone with a learning disability or autistic spectrum conditions, parents or carers might want to stay with them. Sometimes a child will want a parent or a carer to be there. What the coaches always do is talk to that child or athlete first and explain the plan for the day, and they can decide whether they need that parental support or not, but they always set that expectation first as well. Another top tip from Ruth is that you'll also need to consider your training facility. Before an athlete even starts with your club, you'll need to carefully look at access, particularly if an athlete is using a wheelchair or has difficulty walking, making sure that there's car parking nearby, that there's lighting levels that are adequate if you're training in the evening, somewhere to sit to change shoes, accessible toilets, and making sure that accessible toilets and that all these accessible facilities are open in the evenings if you have evening training. They've also got a list of famous faces, and one of their more famous faces is Neil Faki, who you'll maybe recognise from Paralympic cycling. He actually competed for Great Britain at the 2008 Paralympics in Beijing in the 100 metre and 200 metre sprints, which is really cool. He took up athletics with the club at 21, which is quite an older age to start athletics, but as we've kind of already indicated, with a smaller pool of athletes in each class, there's a kind of broader life cycle of an athlete, if that makes sense. Modifications to Neil's training included training at quieter times, so he could hear everybody clearly, and because his eyesight wasn't always reliable, especially in the evenings. They placed some LED lights around the track during low light as well. And below in the picture, the lower picture, you'll actually see two athletes that both train with AAAC. The athlete on the right is Lewis Clout, and the athlete on the left is Ian Boyd. Lewis actually attended a Talent ID event at 17 years old, and he became involved in the club that way. And prior to that, he was actually playing for the national cerebral palsy football squad. Lewis's events are 100 metres, 200 metres, and long jump, although he does dabble in other events. And he also represented Scotland at the 2014 Commonwealth Games, and also Scotland at the CP ISRA, which is the national sporting body for people with cerebral palsy, World Games 2015 and 2018. And Ian is following a similar path to Lewis. He was transferred from football in 2014. And he was inspired by Lewis to get involved in athletics after he saw him at the Commonwealth Games. And Ian's been really great. You know, he progressed really quickly, and he's represented Scotland at the UK School Games in 2015, and he's on his way up to some great things. And Lewis and Ian, they're currently training alongside non-disabled national and international athletes, and that's with their track training and their strength and conditioning training. So they're just as involved as everybody else. If you'd like to get a bit more information about Aberdeen Amateur Athletics Club, or find out a little bit more about their journey into being inclusive, or to find more about their adaptations that they've made, or get any top tips, Ruth Watson is available for any correspondence, and you can get a hold of her on pathways at aberdeenaac.co.uk, or you can go through their website to get a bit more information about their club. I still don't think that a lot of people take the impact of sport on mental health as serious. So in this workshop, we've just really covered a snippet of how to include disabled people in sport, what kind of things you might need to consider for your club, and how important it is to make sure that your club is inclusive for people with a range of impairments. But our learning doesn't stop there. There's a lot more that you can do in your free time, if you have any. And one of the things that you can do is visit the Scottish Disability Sport website and go to the resources page. And there's a whole load of tips, ideas, examples, and information about including people with disabilities in various sports. It's all free and it's all accessible on there. There's also a free CPD workshop on self-reflection and developing your coaching philosophy, which is offered as part of Scottish Disability Sports COVID-19 contingency learning, and the address to access that is on your screen. Mental health and other support and resources are also available through Scottish Disability Sports Helpful Resources page, and that's really important because there's some specific information on there about working with people who have disabilities and who are experiencing poor mental health conditions. And also there's Scottish Athletics' own disability inclusion training, which is really good for any clubs which are involved in run, jump, throw activities, and that could be including Jog Scotland, that could be any running or jogging groups, or full athletics clubs. And information about that is on the Scottish Athletics website. There's not any courses that are advertised at present, but if you go on the website and click on the coaching links, you should be able to find any information there as and when it comes live. And the disability inclusion training workshop offered through Scottish Athletics is offered free of charge. Another source that's well worth tapping into is a paper that we've developed in response to the COVID-19 crisis. And this is full of helpful tips on how to create a safe and welcoming and accessible and an inclusive environment for sport and physical activity for people with impairments. It also explains some of the barriers that people face with going into sport if they have a disability, and it's really useful if you're a facility provider, a club, a coach, a sports governing body, or just anybody else involved in sport. And although it was developed in response to the pandemic, it's really something that could be used at any time, and would really be keen to see all facilities, all clubs, all governing bodies adopt this going forward. If you want to read a little bit about it, it's on our Grampian Disability Sport website. So if you visit www.grampiandisabilitysport.org.uk/news, you'll be able to see the article there. And if you'd like some more support or more of a bespoke tailored approach to your club becoming more inclusive, please, please, please just get in touch. I can advise on things such as funding, accessibility, getting in touch with athletes. I can help you with your imagery. Anything that you need, get in touch and I'll see if I can help you with it. You can get me on alison.shaw@scottishdisabilitysport.com, or you can call me or text me on 07828 744 848. If you're keen to become an affiliate of Grampian Disability Sport, or you want to find out a little bit more about their organisation and how they can support you, just visit their website. It's www.grampiandisabilitysport.org.uk, and there's a page all about documentation, which will give you an opportunity to view their affiliation documents and what the benefits of affiliation are. And finally, thank you so much for taking part today, and please be sure to get in touch if you have any queries at all.